Congregation, I'm Rabbi John Hausman. This is my synagogue. We're so pleased that on a Monday night, it's not usually the best night on which to host speakers, but you all traversed the highways and byways of Greater Boston to come with us to listen to a guy who really functions at the center of security policy issues in this country. Torah Congregation, I'm Rabbi John Hausman. This is my synagogue. We're so pleased that on a Monday night, it's not usually the best night on which to host speakers, but you all traversed the highways and byways of Greater Boston to come with us to listen to a guy who really functions at the center of security policy issues in this country and the world today.
Thank you, Rabbi John. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have spoken to any number of ecumenical organizations and Jewish organizations in the New York area in particular. You'll be shocked to learn that synagogues in New York, however, have not been knocking my door down. I had to think about that a little bit, but I think this actually is the first time I've spoken actually at a synagogue. Oh my God. So be gentle. I guess I also ought to start with a confession, which is really much harder than anything I have to say in this area for me to come clean about. I am from the Bronx. I'm not like those guys from the Bronx that were here over the weekend. In fact, I'm like, as I was telling some of the guys at dinner this evening, I'm actually one of the dopey guys from the Bronx who ended up being a meth fan. And I can't spell Teixeira, although I used to be able to spell Yastrzemski. I don't know if I still can or not. What I thought would be important to talk about tonight, and we can discuss whatever you'd like to discuss on the national security front later in the evening. But I think, to the extent I want to make some remarks, what I'd like to focus on is the report that Rabbi John talked about, and specifically to the extent it covers the issue that I wrote about in my book, which I'm not, believe me, I'm not holding this up for sale purposes. There's actually a message here. The book I wrote was called The Grand Jihad. And I would love to be able to tell you that this was some pithy title that I came up with after a couple of decades of trying to analyze the phenomenon that we've been dealing with in terms of the threat to our national security for the last 2 decades, really. But actually, these aren't my words. Yeah, sure. These aren't my words, the Grand Jihad. They actually are taken from an internal Muslim Brotherhood memorandum from 1991, which was captured by the FBI in connection with a trove of documents probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. And the memo was written by the Muslim Brotherhood's leadership in the United States and directed to the global leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And what the Brotherhood in the United States, what their leaders were addressing in the memo, was how the group in the United States saw their work, how they saw their mission in America. And what they described it as, bluntly, remember these are people from a secret organization who were speaking to each other and not expecting that any one of us would ever be able to peer inside that. They described their work as a grand jihad aimed at the elimination and destruction of Western civilization from within by sabotage. Now, that's not only a pretty blunt description of what they're up to, it's actually a quite factual description of what they're up to, and what in fact they have been up to for over 3 generations inside the United States. The Muslim Brotherhood's tentacles in America go back to the early 1960s. And they have been on this mission since then. And the reason I thought it was important to try to cover the Muslim Brotherhood's mission in the United States and how they go about it is because, having been on what are called, like, prosecutors and lawyers love military metaphors, right? So the front lines of the battle that we've had with radical Islam. You know, I think now, thankfully, post 9/11, we've had real front lines. But back when I became involved in this, the front line of America's confrontation with radical Islam was the courtroom. And it seemed to me, after having looked at this for a very long time, that we had been so focused on terrorism because of the immediacy of it, because of the heinous nature of it, because that was how the threat was presented to us back in 1993 when the World Trade Center was bombed. I still regard that as radical Islam's declaration of war against the United States, the announcement to us that they could hit us here and do it in the heart of the financial district. But I think we focused so closely on terrorism. And we are, by nature, depending on your perspective, either extraordinarily politically correct, or I think the better way, at least from our perspective, to put it is so respectful of people's freedom of conscience, so respectful of their right to believe what they wish to believe and to worship the way they wish to worship, that we spent all of our attention on terrorism, and quite consciously, none of our attention on the ideology that fuels the terrorism. And in many ways, that ideology is a more profound threat to the United States than the terrorism is, because it's able to slipstream behind the terrorism and to take advantages of the freedoms that are available in a Western society, the kind of society that we want to have. So the last book, The Grand Jihad, was an effort to try to do what I don't think we did early in the 90s to our detriment, which is to try to wrestle with this ideology, to try to understand what is it that makes people kill violently, and what else are they trying to accomplish. If you believe the narrative that you've heard from the United States government going back to 1993, it runs something like this. There are a relative fringe handful, a lunatic handful of violent extremists. We don't even call them, we don't even try to call them radical Islam anymore, because radical Islam is too provocative. In fact, we're even trying to get away from the term war on terror, because terror is provocative because it comes right out of the Quran. War is provocative because it too comes right out of the Quran. I think on is still okay, but it may not be by next week. But the point is that we've made a really Herculean effort not to look at the ideology, because it comes under the umbrella of religion and religious liberty. So we not only haven't studied it, we sort of consciously avoid it. And that really is a violation of the first law of good intelligence, of good military tactics, of good law enforcement. You always want to know not only who the bad guys are, but what motivates what they're apt to do next. And that, I think, is the place that we really drop the ball. And let me say this much. You can say a lot of bad things about trying terrorists, and particularly enemy combatants in wartime, in our civilian courts. And having been through that exercise up close and personal, I can tell you I've probably said every single bad thing that you can say about what a crazy idea it is to do things that way. But there is one good thing that I think comes out of it. And that is that no matter what the government says in the White House, in the main justice, the headquarters of the Justice Department down in Washington, or even on the courthouse steps about how the threat only comes from a handful of violent extremists and everything else is fine and we don't have to worry about ideology. In the four corners of a trial, in a courtroom proceeding, jurors will not convict people, particularly of serious crimes, unless you prove to them what was done and why it was done. So the courtroom, I think, has been the only place where you have gotten relatively uninhibited a narrative about the nexus between Islamist ideology and Islamist terror. And I'm here to tell you, not that you probably need to know this, but it's not just Islamist ideology and Islamist terror. It's a nexus between Islamic ideology and Islamic supremacism, of which terrorism is only a single item on the menu, is only one manifestation. After all these years, we don't even have an agreement in the United States about what jihad is. We have so suppressed our discussion, our consideration of the ideology that threatens us, that even so basic a concept as the fact that we're attacked and why we're attacked is something that has basically been a suppressed discussion. Jihad is always and everywhere about the implementation and the spreading of Sharia. Sharia is Islam's legal and political system. When we talk about Islam and we talk about it as a religion, I think we're missing a lot in terms of trying to grapple with what the ideology is. Islam is not a religious tradition in the way that we are familiar with the traditions and practices of religion in the West. Islam is a full-purpose, comprehensive, socio-economic, political, legal, and military system that has its own code. It is a complete, I dare say, a totalitarian system in the literal sense of that term for living all of life. I am not suggesting for a moment that it doesn't have principles that we would recognize as governing the spiritual side of life. But its ambitions are much beyond that. And it does not recognize, at least in the interpretation of it that we're dealing with, which I would argue is a mainstream interpretation of Islam, not a fringe interpretation. It does not recognize a division between the secular authority and the spiritual authority. In fact, the classical interpretation of Islam would tell you that that can't be Islam, that there can't be a division. When you understand that that is what Sharia is and what the ideology is about, jihad becomes much easier to understand. There are many people on my side of the debate who insist that jihad is always and everywhere about military combat and conquest. And I think those people have it wrong. That doesn't mean that jihad is what the government wants to tell you it is and has been telling us it is. The government tells us that jihad is the internal struggle for personal betterment. If you listen to the Obama administration long enough, I think you'd come away thinking jihad was the struggle to remember to brush after every meal, that it's not much more serious or consequential than that. But jihad is not always about physical combat. It is the mission, the supremacist mission, to spread Islam. And it doesn't need to happen militarily or by force if the spreading can be done effectively without physical activity, violent activity. When Mr. Brennan, who is President Obama's top national security advisor on the White House staff, When he said that Islam was to struggle internally to become a better person, that's almost right, but it's not quite right. It's the struggle to become a better Muslim, which means a more Sharia-compliant Muslim. When he said that it would be a community's struggle to rid itself of evil influences like narcotics trafficking and the like, that may be in the ballpark of being right, but it's wrong in a very narrow and important way. It's not the struggle to rid a neighborhood or a community of evil influences. It's a struggle to rid the community of non-Islamic influences. And in that, I think, there's all the difference. What we need to recognize is that we are confronted by an ideology that is much more mainstream in the Islamic world than Western commentators have wanted to come to grips with. And that very much does have an intention of conquering us, of ending up supreme, of setting up Islamic states with an eye toward a global caliphate. And the fact that we think that it's highly unlikely that that could ever happen doesn't mean that they don't believe it will happen, and doesn't believe that they don't spend every waking moment trying to figure out how to advance that vision. The other thing that's important to realize is that there are two, I want to stay away from Iran for a moment and just deal with the Sunni world. There are two ways in which the Sharia agenda has been advanced in a very aggressive way toward the West, and in particular toward the United States. One is the Al-Qaeda way. Al-Qaeda, much like the precursor to Al-Qaeda that I prosecuted back in the early to mid-90s, is an out-and-out terrorist organization. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. It's not even Hamas. It doesn't pretend to, do social welfare work and run hospitals. Al-Qaeda, bin Laden has done a little bit of that in some of the places where he's been allowed to live. But Al-Qaeda doesn't make any bones about what they want to do. They want to kill you, or bludgeon you, extort you into accepting Sharia. And that is what they're about. They're a brute terrorist organization. Then there's the Muslim Brotherhood. They are not a brute terrorist organization, but they have a terrorist past. For the Muslim Brotherhood, terrorism is one item on a very broad and very sophisticated menu. And it changes depending on where they operate. So that, for example, in the Palestinian territories, I remember during the recent spontaneous secular democratic uprising in Egypt, I remember a number of times dealing with people who were sort of gingerly pointed out that, well, the Muslim Brotherhood does support Hamas. And I had to correct that argument when it came up. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't support Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas. If you read the Hamas charter, they tell you flat out, we are the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood's primary mission in the United States since the creation of Hamas has been to support Hamas. I mean, that's what they do here, because they are the Muslim Brotherhood. In that arena, terrorism is one of the main items on the menu. In the United States, not so much. They have a much different plan in the United States. They're very sophisticated about how they go about it. And they are very adaptable, changing their methods as they go from place to place. But the important thing for us to understand is that while people want to tell you that the Brotherhood is moderate, compared to, say, Al-Qaeda, and who wouldn't be moderate compared to Al-Qaeda, right? But the Muslim Brotherhood's difference with Al-Qaeda is about tactics. They are both in absolutely the same place about what the ultimate goal is. Their differences only involve how best to achieve the goal, how best to install Sharia, create Islamicized societies with an eye toward ultimately establishing a global caliphate. They're on the same, when they tell you that the Muslim Brotherhood's moderate and therefore we can work with them, I would strongly suggest that you point out to people that the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda may argue with each other, but they have a lot more in common with each other than either of them has in common with us. They are both serving a Sharia agenda. Why is the Muslim Brotherhood's program different? The Brotherhood started in the 1920s, and I think it's an interesting story because Hassan al-Banna, who was an Egyptian educator and is the founder of the Brotherhood, was a contemporary of Ataturk, who at that point in time in the 20s was beginning to purge Islam from public life in Turkey. Ataturk took a look at the same world Banna looked at and said that the thing that was holding Muslims back from basically taking a step into modernity, from embracing the modern world, was Islam. Ataturk, by the way, is a Muslim. I've always thought it was interesting that we seem to think we know more about Islam than people like Ataturk and the Blind Sheikh, etc. But Ataturk, who knew what he was talking about, said that if we're ever going to advance, we need to basically separate mosque and state. We need to turn Islam into something that is a set of spiritual principles that Muslims can use to guide their private spiritual life, but that otherwise does not dominate the public square. And thereupon followed by Ataturk, basically, it spikes up and down, but pretty much an 80-year project to purge Islam from public life, a project which I think we can almost conclusively at this point say has failed, because we now have basically resurgent Islam under an Islamist government in Turkey. Banna looked at the same world and said, no. The problem isn't too much Islam. The problem is not enough Islam. And in particular, not enough of the right kind of Islam. Banna's version of Islam, Banna's interpretation that he followed was Salafist, which was a kind of reformist Islam that sought to turn back the clock. The Salafis were the original generations, the caliphs who led the original generations of Islam back in the 7th and 8th century. And what Banna and the Brotherhood wanted to do was move Islam back to what they regarded as that pure state, that unadulterated state of Islam that was the Islam that Allah prescribed for mankind. And his program was to go about that, but in a very sophisticated way. Not to compel people to become Muslims or to become his Salafist version of Muslims, at least not directly compel them, but to actually start a movement toward that end, which was a ground-up revolutionary movement. Banna started with the Muslim person. His program then moved out to the family, the town, the city, and the greater, wider society. Terrorism was something that was always understood to be necessary at some point and under some conditions, but again, it was just to be one item on the menu. For Banna, the most important thing was gradually to tighten the control of the movement on the main institutions in society. They wanted to control the schools. They wanted to insinuate themselves into the media. They wanted to get into the banks and the other major social institutions in the society. And here's probably the most important difference between Brotherhood ideology and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda will never sit down with a government that it's trying to overthrow. I mean, I imagine they might sit down with them to take a surrender, but they would never sit down to negotiate with a government that they were trying to overthrow. Their view of it would be that the act of negotiating legitimizes the enemy, and that's something you ought never ever do. So they'll kill you, but they won't sit down and negotiate with you. They'll take a surrender, they'll allow you to live as a dhimmi in a Muslim society, but they have no interest in negotiating with government, other than to extort you into doing whatever it is as a government that they want you to do. The Brotherhood has always thought that was an insane way to go about advancing the ball up the field. The Brotherhood has always felt that you not only want to negotiate with government, you not only want to deal with government on a regular basis, we want to get our people inside government and hollow out government as an institution from within and move government from within closer to our ideology. And that's the way to advance the ball, and that's the way to assure that when you actually do advance the Sharia agenda, you can consolidate those gains. What they felt about terrorism, let me give you what I think is a good example. Yusuf Qaradawi, famous Sunni sheikh, probably the most famous Sunni cleric on the planet these days, certainly the most influential. He is basically the Sharia compass of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2001, when the World Trade Center was destroyed, Qaradawi was one of the first to the front of the line to condemn the attacks on New York, the Pentagon, and the other attempted attack. It caused all of these academics who are apologists for the Islamic movement in the United States to go up in a balloon because the great moderate Qaradawi had condemned the 9/11 attacks. Now, they didn't want to get involved in the fact that he's also issued fatwas calling for suicide bombings. He's written that if women get raped when they're wearing Western-style clothing, they have it coming because they basically invited it to happen. He's got a whole list of things which are, I think in the West would be things that we would regard as pretty noxious attitudes. But he condemned the 9/11 attacks, and he was hailed as a moderate for doing so. About 3 years later, he issued a fatwa calling for the murder of American troops in Iraq. Now, a lot of people said, how do you explain that? Why condemn the 9/11 attacks but then call for the killing of the troops? If we had been paying attention, as I think we should have been paying attention to Sharia, it would be a very obvious answer. In Iraq, American troops are a Western force which is attempting to sew Western ideas and Western institutions into an Islamic country. There's no greater offense as far as Sharia is concerned that non-Muslims can commit than trying to plant the ideals of another civilization into an Islamic country. And the rule is that they have to be fought until they leave. And if it's necessary to use terrorism to fight them, then you use terrorism to fight them. On the other hand, 9/11 was an attack in the United States, a non-Muslim country, against the United States, under circumstances where the sheer brutality of the attack caused the authorities not only to attack Muslim countries, but at least for about 10 or 15 minutes, it seems now, to scrutinize the activities of Islamist organizations inside the United States. That is, the Muslim Brotherhood has no moral problem with terrorism. They have a tactical problem with terrorism being used in a way that is counterproductive, that ultimately ends up in a net loss for the Islamist movement. And they feel, with good reason, that they have a very good thing going in the United States, and that they are advancing the Sharia agenda in the United States quite well without having terrorist attacks that only end up resulting in a reciprocal, not only attacks on Muslim countries, but as I said, scrutiny of what the Islamist organizations are doing in the United States. What about those Islamist organizations? Let me just talk for a few minutes about what the Muslim Brotherhood has done and what it's trying to do in the United States. The Brotherhood has been here since the early 1960s. They started out with the Muslim Students Associations, which started out in the Midwestern part of the United States, where a lot of people who were transplanted from the Middle East to the United States came to study. They started out with only a handful of chapters. There are now somewhere between 500 and 600 chapters of the Muslim Students Associations in the United States and Canada. Required reading in the Muslim Students Associations remains the ideals and writings of Hassan al-Banna and of Sayyid Qutb, who was probably the Brotherhood's most important theoretician of the latter half of the 20th century. They still follow that blueprint. They still follow that roadmap. If you read Banna's work, what he calls for in this idea of a ground-up revolution is to have in every city an axis of the movement. And what he means by an axis of the movement is the mosque and the neighborhood Islamic center or Islamic association. So the Brotherhood in the early 1970s established an organization called the North American Islamic Trust. The NAIT's basic job was to buy up real estate throughout the United States. And it is on those plots of real estate that the NAIT purchased up that many of the country's mosques and Islamic community centers have been built. In fact, there are expert assessments that contend that probably somewhere between 70% and 80% of mosques in the United States are somehow influenced by Muslim Brotherhood organizations in the United States, primarily by the NAIT buying up real estate, but also by the fact that the other Islamist organizations, including what I'm going to get to in a moment, have been very important in terms of staffing, who controls those mosques and Islamic community centers, and also providing the literature that you can obtain in those community centers. The most important of the Islamist organizations that has been created and is a sort of a tentacle of the Brotherhood in the United States is an organization called the Islamic Society of North America. ISNA was established to be sort of a graduate program for the Muslim Students Associations. In fact, the two organizations now actually view themselves as one. When ISNA has its annual convention, I think they had their 40th or so not long ago, they're not talking about 40 years of ISNA. They trace the beginning of the organization back to when the Muslim Students Associations had their first convention. ISNA is the most important Islamic organization in the United States. Its conventions draw the most people. It's the most influential. It has more of an entree with government organizations than any Islamist organization in the United States. When I mentioned the Grand Jihad before, in that memo that went from the Brotherhood's American leaders to the global leaders in Egypt, that trove of documents I refer to formed the backbone of what turned out to be the most important terrorism financing prosecution that's ever been done by the Justice Department, the Holy Land Foundation trial, which ended a couple of years ago, I guess it was now 2008, ended with the convictions of all the defendants involved in a conspiracy to send tens of millions of dollars from the United States to Hamas, much of it during the Intifada. The organizations I've just described, and in particular the Islamic Society of North America and the North American Islamic Trust, were cited by the Justice Department as being unindicted co-conspirators in that case involving the financing of Hamas's activities in the United States. You've probably heard that before. I always think that it's not all that important that the Justice Department labels someone an unindicted co-conspirator, because after all, they never get to come into court. Unless you charge somebody, they don't get to defend themselves from that. The important thing is not the label unindicted co-conspirator, it's the proof, it's the facts that are put in evidence by the government at the trial, which is the basis for the contention that these organizations are unindicted co-conspirators. And I can tell you that among the things that the Justice Department proved was that the Holy Land Foundation, which was basically a piggy bank for Hamas that was set up by the Brotherhood in the United States, was actually established and run out of the office space that was shared by the North American Islamic Trust and ISNA. And part of the way that they got money from the United States to Hamas was to send checks and cash through bank accounts that were set up by ISNA and NAIT, through their bank accounts to Hamas and Hamas fronts in the territories. That's what caused them to be labeled unindicted co-conspirators, not as their mouthpieces contend our anti-Muslim bias. They actually proved at trial that they were an instrument that was used to help Hamas. The reason I think it's important to stress that is just to show you what kind of an entree ISNA has in government. It was in 2008, at the trial where it was established that ISNA was an unindicted co-conspirator, that these people were convicted of sending all this money to Hamas. In 2009, just a few months after the convictions, ISNA had its annual convention. Do you know who was the keynote speaker? Valerie Jarrett. Valerie Jarrett, who was probably President Obama's, one of President Obama's closest political aides and confidants from his Chicago days, was sent by the administration to be the keynote address giver at this convention of this organization, which had not only been rumored to be involved in some very bad activity, but actually had been shown to be involved in some very bad activity. The other Brotherhood connected outfit that's worth mentioning, and one that is probably the most famous one, if not any longer, I think the most important one in America, is CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. I always think it's worth telling the story of how CARE got its start, just to stress the point that while we have basically been consciously avoiding their ideology, they go to school on us. In the mid-90s, when Clinton struck the deal between Arafat and the Israeli government, and the peace process got up and running to the extent it ran, one of the things that came out of that was the Clinton administration became very opposed to Hamas, which was not going to go along with the peace process. And that was just fine with Arafat because Hamas was Arafat's main political rival. So the law started to change with respect to counterterrorism and Hamas in particular. And eventually what happens is we have these material support to terrorism laws, where if the government designates an organization as a terrorist organization, it becomes a crime and a civil violation, civil law violation for which you can be sued, to give any contributions of either money or other material help to these organizations. And one of the first organizations that was designated as a global terrorist organization was Hamas. This caused a profound problem for the Brotherhood and its tentacle organizations in the United States, because many of the key members of those organizations were on record and had come to the attention of the American authorities for being people who were supportive of Hamas before it was a crime to be supportive of Hamas. That created a big problem for them. And in a series of meetings that we now have a lot of information about, not least because the FBI actually bugged one of them, we learned that the Brotherhood-connected organizations in the United States were of a mind that they needed a new organization because they were all under heat for being Hamas sympathizers. A new organization that didn't have the same past that critics could point to as their organizations had. And because they go to school on us, one of the things that the people who conceived of Hamas, of CARE, insisted was that it be an organization that had legal acumen but media savvy. And somebody had to brainstorm, let's call it a civil rights organization. Because in America, it doesn't matter what you are or what you stand for. If you tell them you're a civil rights organization, you're gold. And you'll become the go-to guy for every media guy in the country. Every time a civil rights issue comes up, whether or not it has anything to do with Muslims. And it worked like a charm. The organization actually was carried by the media and had entree into government agencies as a respected civil rights organization. And it didn't matter that time after time after time, we had people who were connected to Hamas who were either convicted in terrorism cases or caught up in terrorism investigations. It didn't matter that every single accused Muslim that they went to bat for, I think almost every single one, was convicted of what he was charged of, notwithstanding that CARE would instantly come out the minute anyone was arrested and say anti-Muslim bias, profiling, the whole bit that they came out with. None of that mattered. All that mattered was they said they were a civil rights organization and they were moderate. And then, as a result, they basically got the media and government bill of good health. I think their influence has diminished because they too were cited as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Hamas financing case. But on the other hand, I think there's good reason to think they're making a comeback. They're back. You even see them on Fox News, on CNN. They were front and center throughout what was going on in Egypt. They're still front and center with respect to stories on Libya. And they've started to, even if they're not necessarily being invited to meet with the White House staff, although I can't even say that's not going on, they're back to having meetings with various government agencies. That is the way that the Brotherhood's conspiracy works in the United States. And its aim is to try to insinuate Sharia principles into our institutions and, in particular, into our law. And there's good reason to think that they're having success in that score. In my home state, my now home state of New Jersey, we recently had a judge who would not give a woman a protective order, even though she was being serially beaten and raped by the man who she was trying to get a divorce from. The judge's reasoning, if you can call it that, was that the man involved, they're both, the husband and wife are both Muslims, that the man was only operating under his religious principles, under which, as he understood it, she had no right to say no. And she refused to give him, the court refused to give the woman a protective order. Now, happily, that case got reversed by the higher court. But we don't know how many of these kinds of cases are in the lower courts simmering along unreported. We really find out about cases when they basically make it up the chain and get to the appellate court level. We have a thriving business of Sharia-compliant finance. It's become basically an industry in the United States, supported to fairly well by Harvard and Georgetown, by the way. The idea behind it, even its proponents like Sheikh Karadawi say, it's financial jihad. It's an attempt to insinuate Sharia principles into our financial system. So this is an ongoing program. They're pushing in the law, they're pushing in the institutions, they're pushing throughout society. They're committing terrorism where they think terrorism advances the ball. In Europe, where they've seen that they can basically seize territory, we now have a landscape throughout Europe of basically what the police call no-go zones, places where police and first responders no longer go into the Islamic enclaves because it's hostile for them when they go in there. So we haven't seen that much in America yet.